Hello, welcome to Chapter 15, Reconstruction and the New South. Okay, so here's the highlights. Essentially, the big question is how are we going to bring the South back into the Union, and what will happen with the plight of newly freed slaves? Okay, so the aftermath of war and emancipation, the South is ruined. I mean, physically, it's gutted. If you remember, all their capital was tied up in their slaves and their land. Now, with slaves being freed, their capital is all gone. 20% of white males are dead. Um, and what you get, and this will happen a little bit later, but you get the rise of the myth of the lost cause. And the myth of the lost cause essentially expounds this idea that the South's motives were just, they just were outmanned and outgunned by the North. Okay. But what it does is essentially elevates Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson to cult-like status heroes of this lost cause. They fought valiantly, but just came up short in the end. Okay. The competing notions of freedom for the ex-slaves. What does that mean? And that becomes part of the debate. Okay. And for the ex-slaves, it means opportunity. The question is, does it also mean legal protection? Does it mean redistribution of land and wealth? Independence, free from white control. Okay. For the ex-slaves, in particular, the opportunity and free from white control is the most important thing for them. One of the things Congress established was the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau helped provide food, schools, and resettlement for the newly freed slaves. And that's the problem. So emancipation is, or the ending of slavery is great, but the problem is what happens now. Okay, so some of them actually end up going to work back for their plantations because they have no other options. Okay, so the issues of Reconstruction, and so it runs a gamut in terms of like how should we bring the South back in. And so there are ultra radical Republicans, moderates, and conservatives. And essentially, the radical Republicans they want political equality for blacks. In terms of the civil rights, that's a choice on parts of local governments, but they want political equality for blacks. For conservatives, they think abolition itself is fine. Okay, and so you have this debate. Lincoln thinks the South should be treated like a misbehaving child, and so essentially they should just be given like a slap on the wrist. His 10% plan is if 10% of people, the voting males in the Confederate States sign a loyalty oath, um, and they adopt the 13th Amendment and abolish slavery, then they should be allowed to vote, or they should be allowed to come back in the Union. The Wade Davis bill is the radical Republicans' plans in Congress, which they want a majority of white males to take the loyalty oath. They want to disenfranchise leaders, and so if you're a political or military leader for the Confederacy, you are disenfranchised, you can't vote, you can't serve in government, and they have to adopt the 13th Amendment. And the Wade Davis bill actually gets passed, but it is pocket vetoed by Lincoln. So tragically, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, takes over, who was actually a Southern Democrat. He had him on the ticket to help kind of balance it out. But now he is elevated to the presidency. Okay, and what happens is Johnson falls along the lines of Lincoln in terms of he wants to fold the South back in as soon as possible. And initially, the radical Republicans think he is going to be with them, okay, because he hates the Southern aristocracy. What they don't know is that he's also a racist and that he hates blacks. And he has this infamous quote that he wished every family had a black person to do the menial task. And so Johnson is not a friend of Reconstruction at all. On top of that, the Southern governments, the Southerners are unrepentant, okay, and they actually have more representatives now because the Three-Fifths Compromise is dead. Attitudes in the North will harden as well. Okay, so Johnson just has, he has a terrible political skills, angry, poor judgment, and so that's going to set up a showdown between Johnson and the radical Republicans. And what happens is the South, as they're admitted back because the plan is pretty lenient, they begin to enact these black codes. Okay, and black codes are something that you're only going to talk about in terms of early Reconstruction.
Black codes aren't quite the same thing as Jim Crow laws, which will take place after Reconstruction. But black codes essentially are trying to recreate slavery without slavery. So they limit the rights of free blacks. They limit their movements. You can't leave town if you owe debt. They can put you to work if you owe debt. Um, so you can't serve on a jury. You can't carry a gun. All these things. And what happens is the radical Republicans in Congress, they, in order to protect them, they passed the first Civil Rights Act, 1866 Civil Rights Act. And Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act, and the radical Republicans actually override Johnson's veto. Okay, and so it becomes a showdown. Does America support Johnson's views, or do they support the radical Republicans' view? And in the midterm campaign, um, that is essentially the showdown. And to make those civil rights permanent, they're going to turn it into the 14th Amendment. And the radical Republicans prevail. 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship for blacks. So the three amendments you should know: 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, 14th Amendment defines citizenship, and 15th Amendment is voting rights. Okay, so radical Republicans win. They get the 14th Amendment. Johnson essentially is defanged. He's still in office, but he's essentially powerless. Okay, now that the radical Republicans have prevailed, they're going to institute their plan. And their plans are the three Reconstruction bills. And essentially what the Reconstruction bills do is they will break the South into 5 military districts. They will assign a general to be in charge of that, which will guarantee protection for African Americans. In addition to that, the 15th Amendment will be passed, which will again guarantee voting rights for African Americans, because there are Southerners, and this is the rise of the KKK, that will try to disenfranchise blacks by terrorizing them. Okay, so like I said, Johnson was still in office, but the radical Republicans weren't done with him yet. Okay, and so they are setting them up. So they passed this Tenure of Office Act, which says you can't fire a cabinet official that was approved by the Senate without the Senate's approval. So essentially, because the Senate said they approved of him, you also need the Senate's approval to get rid of him. And Johnson said, whatever, they work for me, I'm going to fire them. Goes to fire Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, who was a holdover from Lincoln's cabinet. And I think Stanton actually hides in his office for several hours so they can't give him the papers. And because he violated the Tenure of Office Act, the radical Republicans impeached Johnson. And so impeach has two meanings. It means to bring up on charges as well as to be removed from office. So Johnson is acquitted by one vote. And in the one vote, they didn't want to establish the precedent that you can remove a president just because you disagree with him politically, okay, which would be a bad precedent, in my opinion. Okay, so this is Reconstruction. These are the years the states get admitted back into the Union. Again, so the war is essentially over 1865. You can see it takes several years for many of them to come back in. The Reconstruction government. So this is the brief window of opportunity and equality for African Americans. Okay, again, with it's broken up into military districts protected by governors. Scallywags, and these are derisive terms coined by the South. So scallywags are Southern whites that cooperated with Reconstruction governments. Okay, carpetbaggers are Northern whites that come down to participate in the Reconstruction governments, and of course then have the freedmen. Again, these are terms, nicknames given by the Southern whites, which felt like both scallywags and carpetbaggers are taking advantage of the chaos in the South. Okay, and they're ripping the South off blind. And so historians, when they've looked at it, was there corruption in Southern governments? Yes, there was. But at the same time, in the North, there was a lot of political corruption as well. So it wasn't just a phenomenon found in the Southern governments. It was essentially all over the country at that time. Okay, in terms of education, they do have segregated schools that try to provide education for African Americans. The one big failure of Reconstruction was the land redistribution. And so briefly, at the end of the war, General Sherman had issued Field Order 15, which was to give 40 acres to every adult male and a mule, so 40 acres and a mule. They would confiscate land from the plantations and redistribute it to the slaves. However, that plan was shot down, and it never happened except for the Sea Islands off of Georgia, and I believe the African American families that were able to take advantage of that are prosperous. But there is no land redistribution. So what does that mean for many free blacks? How do you make a living? A lot of them have to turn back to the land. So there's sharecropping. Sharecropping is where you essentially rent the land, and you would pay at the end at harvest time with a share of your crops. So it's called sharecropping. They also have tenant farming, where you would just rent the land. But of course, if you had a bad harvest, then now we're in trouble. And then you also have the crop lien system, where essentially you borrow money and you put your crops up as lien. Okay, so on this slide, you can kind of see an example of a plantation that would now be broken up into the individual plots of land. Again, not that they owned it, but that's how they farmed. And then the pernicious thing about this plan was that essentially it trapped you in a cycle of debt. That once you fell behind, there's almost no way to get out. And then you had to continue growing cotton because that was the most profitable crop. And essentially, in a lot of ways, economically, the South doesn't change. Slavery is over, but farming and cotton farming in particular still dominates. Okay, so the crop lien system, again, you would get, because there's no big banks down there in the South, you would get a loan from the country store, right? So you would need to get a loan to buy this, this season's seeds, maybe some new tools, things like that. Your crops would be the lien. A lien means they can claim it if you're unable to pay back the money. Okay, we're going to pivot now to the Grant administration. So, General Grant, who was a great general, not as good president, in over his head, kind of ineffectual. Relied on the spoils system and his party to kind of rise to the top. And so there's liberal Republicans that challenge Grantism, and so there's a lot of corruption. He himself is not corrupt, but there's a lot of corruption during his administration. Okay, and a couple of these scandals, the Credit Mobilier, this is one dealing with the railroads, and so what happened, the railroad companies would give kickbacks or shares of stock to administration officials. There's the whiskey ring, which they're skimming whiskey taxes, and similar to the Indian ring in terms of bribes for positions in the Indian Affairs Department. Okay, so again, Grant himself was not corrupt, but there's a lot of corruption in his administration, much to the ire of the liberal Republicans in particular. Okay, during the Grant administration, the greenback question, so there's a panic in 1873, and so this will become one of the issues of the day after the Civil War in terms of money. So there's hard versus soft money. Again, hard money, I think we talked about this during Jacksonian democracy. Hard money is gold or silver. Soft money is like paper money, and then the greenbacks are even, it's just the printing of greenbacks. I think they did this during the Civil War. And so one way to alleviate the panic, and anytime you hear panic, it is an economic recession, is to put more money out there. Okay, which actually would help, but I don't think they fully understood it. Elsewhere, Republican diplomacy. There's not much going on foreign policy-wise. A couple things that do happen, though. We purchased Alaska 1867 from Russia. They make fun of Secretary of State Seward, call it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox, and then they discover gold in Alaska, and nobody's laughing anymore. The Alabama claims is another thing. And so the U.S. was mad at Britain because they violated neutrality. They built a couple ships, the Alabama being one of them, that's fired upon Northern Union ships and caused some damage. And so we wanted Britain to pay for it, and Britain does pay. Okay, so the Southern states redeemed again, and for what becomes clear by the ballot results is that Grant and the Republicans are essentially winning with the votes of the blacks. Okay, and that if you could disenfranchise blacks, keep them from voting, scare them from voting, the Democrats in the South could take power. Okay, and so that's what begins to happen. You get the rise of the Ku Klux Klan at this time, and there'll be a couple other instances of the Ku Klux Klan. This is one where they are trying to disenfranchise blacks. Okay, and so President Grant passes these enforcement acts to put down the Klan, but it's too late. And what happens? The southern states, the Democrats win control, and that's the Redeemer government. They are redeemed. Okay, so coming up to the end of Reconstruction here, you can see that the Democrat and Green, Samuel J. Tilden, this is the election of 1877. It becomes close. Okay. Or election of 1876. And so what happens, and I don't know why Brinkley does this, but so he slides in this waning northern commitment. And here's the problem. So during Reconstruction, there's a lot going on in this country. We will also be doing westward expansion. In the north, it'll have the Gilded Age, and a little bit towards the end, we will start going overseas and looking for territory. So there's a lot going on. And Darwin's idea comes out in the late 1800s. And there's this belief that, well, if Darwinism is true, why isn't like social Darwinism true? That it applies to the same principle. And so maybe it's survival of the fittest. And so maybe those people that are behind because it's their own fault. Okay. And so people are kind of tired of supporting Reconstruction. We have the 13th Amendment, we have the 14th Amendment, we have the 15th Amendment. It's time to move on. Okay. And so you get this close election in 1876. You get some disputed states in Florida. It's always Florida. Disputed states in Florida and Illinois. And they essentially they create this commission to decide, how can you actually count the votes? And they reach this compromise. In the compromise of 1877, they will give the presidency to the Republicans, Hayes, one more time, in exchange for removing the troops from the South. And the Compromise of 1877 essentially spells the end of Reconstruction. That's over. And for African Americans down in the South, they will go back to second-class status because there are no more military troops to protect them. Okay. So the limits of Reconstruction and legacies of Reconstruction, it sets up the promise. We can talk about this more in our discussions, but it sets up the promise of equality, however, it fails to reach it. But it does establish some of those principles that will be relied on later, in particular, like the modern civil rights movement. Okay, we are going to skip this a little bit. Tenants and sharecroppers, essentially, they start building more railroads and begin manufacturing a little bit. Okay, so what happens socially is you have this black middle class, and you have a small black middle class. Who becomes the leader of African Americans is Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington, he proposes, and this is outlined in his Atlanta Compromise speech. He says blacks should accept segregation. Okay, and in his speech he says we can be separate like fingers on a hand, blacks and whites. But he's speaking to a group of white business owners, said, give us your jobs, cast your bucket down where you are. You can trust us. We've been loyal. We've been faithful. Give us your jobs. And when he says give us your jobs, it means as compared to the immigrants. Okay, and he advocated that blacks should get a vocational education, find some way to support themselves. We can ask for equality later, but let's find some way to support ourselves. And so to support this idea of vocational education, he starts the Tuskegee Institute, which will show up a few times later in history, as a way to train African Americans, okay, in those vocational education. Okay, and now we get the Jim Crow laws, and Jim Crow laws essentially legalize segregation. And so Plessy versus Ferguson is the Supreme Court case that legalizes segregation. It's 1896. There's a man, Homer Plessy, says he should be able to ride in the white train car because he is 1/8. He's only 1/8 black. And it originally is a question of, what's the definition of white? But the Supreme Court expands this to this idea of separate but equal. So you can have separate facilities, train cars, bathrooms, drinking fountains, schools, as long as they're equal. Okay, so again, the Plessy versus Ferguson is the case that kind of sanctions legal segregation. You get the franchise, you get the vote. So how can you restrict blacks from voting? You can't deny them the right because that would violate the 15th Amendment. But you can have poll taxes that say you have to pay. You can have literacy tests. And so they ask you to recite the preamble to the Constitution. They ask you to read paragraphs. One insidious example I just heard in the South, and this is later in the early 20th century, but they gave a blank sheet of paper to a person and said, read this. And they said, oh, there's nothing on that paper. And they said, oh, sorry, you got it wrong. Okay. So that's how they controlled politically to make disenfranchised blacks. Socially, it was lynchings. And so if somebody crossed the social barriers, you dating a white woman, you whistled at somebody, things like that, you crossed the line, it was enforced by lynchings. Okay, and the lynchings were never prosecuted by the Southern governments. Okay, and it creates this unity again, and this is the whole idea of the lost cause. And this with the birth of a nation, one of the first movies, it reinforces. It turns the script. It flips the script. KKK are heroic. They're the ones protecting, kind of going back to that cult of honor, protecting the honor of the South, protecting the honor of white women, and they become united in that.